We were in the second chapter of this book, or the second lesson. In that, we were talking about the purpose of the book, how it was written. We also discussed the cult of Caesar, how that the Caesars were often worshipped as gods, the effect that that had on Christians, and we looked particularly at the Decian persecution that they went through. We were fixing to get to the questions. Before we get to those, I was going to ask if anyone had comments or questions to make before we do that. Okay. Well, this last slide of what I had prepared is pretty much the purpose of the book. It was to tell the Christians in Asia Minor that Rome was ultimately going to be judged and destroyed, and that although it was going to be rough, the Christians had to endure through it, and they would be victorious. Does everyone agree that that's pretty much the message of Revelation? Okay. So the first question, what parts of the Old Testament act as a backdrop, and which books contain the apocalyptic sections? I think we may have answered this one, but the backdrop was pretty much the Babylonian captivity, because at that time the Jews who were in captivity were certainly confused and scared. Their nation had been conquered, they had been carried off. They were wondering what was going to happen. And so books like Ezekiel in particular, but also these others, were written in this apocalyptic style to give them comfort. Some in Jeremiah, but that was basically to a different group. It was the ones that were gone down in Egypt. Yes, Ted?
I just to back up 30 seconds, and yes, everybody agreed. I don't necessarily disagree with, where it says Rome will ultimately be judged and destroyed. I certainly agree with the last half of that, the second point. The first one, I'm not convinced. I know it's not Jerusalem. Don't nobody panic there. But whether it's Rome or something else, I'm open. But at this point, I think it may be something bigger than Rome.
Okay. Certainly it is important that we keep an open mind as we study this book. And we're going to talk about that more in the next lesson when it becomes particularly more evident. Moving on. The second question, the main two functions of the apocalyptic literature. And again, we touched on this to provide comfort and hope, and to provide warnings about disobedience. Yes, Ms. Pat.
Well, back in my early 20s, when I studied Revelation, I guess probably for the first time, I can remember studying it one time when I was a teenager. Had a yellow book, and you had to study. But I wrote in my Bible the 5 methods of interpreting Revelation.
Yes.
That the teacher stated at that time, and this was in after I was 21. But the futuristic, which means they're going to take it literally, continuous, meaning it's historical, like it already happened. The philosophy of history, symbols of the forces at work. Futurist had meaning then and only then. And then the historical background, meaning in the day of origin and message for all time.
Yes. And those are the 5 main methods, or 5 main schools that people adhere to. And it is important to know that as you're trying to study it, because if you get them mixed up, it confuses you a lot. And we're going to cover that a lot in lesson number 3. But you're correct.
There are so many people that think even the book of Daniel, is somehow
connected to the end of the world.
To the book of Revelation. And, you see people even posting on social media that the things that are happening
Yes. And it'll become evident how we look at it, or how I'm teaching it anyway. So, question number 3, explain what is meant by the expression limited prophetic. Well, this was, as you allude to, it was meant to foretell what's fixing to happen. It's not talking about way off in the future. It's going to happen to these people it was written to. How does the fact that the material in Revelation, how does the fact that the material in Revelation is described by the writer as symbolic affect the way we approach it and understand its meaning? Obviously, if it's symbolic, we have to interpret it in the terms that he was trying to get across. We have to understand what he was saying to get that done. Okay. So why is it important to appreciate the sequential nature of the material in the book? And then the other parts of the question, how many times does it mention the resurrection, and how many will there be? Well, let's start from the last one first. How many resurrections are there going to be? There's going to be one. But the book of Revelation mentions it, I didn't count, but several times. And the important thing to remember about the sequential nature is that the same message is being given several times in these several visions. Okay. The significance of numbers. What does 7 mean? Complete. And what about 10?
But there again, I wrote in my Bible at the time we did this, I wrote 7 meaning perfection and 10 meaning completeness.
Okay. What about 12?
I didn't write that one down.
Repetition.
Okay. What he said in the book was that the purpose was to basically connect the dots in the book. The number 7 symbolizes completeness and perfection, as you said. The number 10 symbolizes fullness, which is a little bit different from completion or perfection, but they're closely related. And then the number 12 also has that same connotation. But this is my own opinion. I didn't find this in the book or anywhere else, but whenever I'm seeing the number 12 or the multiples of 12, I'm getting more of an idea of divineness. It's the 144,000. It's the whole group. It's everyone in the church. So it's more than just something complete. It's the entirety. And again, that was just my interpretation. Describe in your own words the particular historical situation which the Revelation addresses. I think we covered that pretty good. It's talking about the persecution that was fixing to hit Asia Minor, and the things that they were going to suffer. So that's why it was written. That's what it addresses. Question 8. Why could Christians not give any quarter to the Roman imperial religion, especially the emperor cult? And why was some compromise not possible? And I want to comment here just a minute. In today's society, everyone pushes for a compromise. Let's give a little, take a little, and we'll meet in the middle.
Compromise is not part of God's plan.
Okay.
I mean, we stand for the one true God, and if you compromise, you try to get in the middle and you don't stand for nothing.
Okay. But if I come and tell you, well, what's the harm of just sprinkling a little dust on the fire? It's not going to hurt you. You know it doesn't mean anything. What's the harm in it?
What's the use? Why are you doing it? Because you won't.
Keeps you from getting killed.
Well, it depends on what the consequences are.
Okay, you're going to get killed if you don't do it.
Yeah. But if you stand for God, you can't have a compromise.
Okay. I think that's the important point. To sprinkle that little incense would be doing what everyone else is doing to worship that other god, and you would be joining right in with them, and no compromise is possible. And God has made it plain that he doesn't accept anything except first place.
Well, if good compromises with evil, then by definition, good's no longer good.
Yes.
It's something else.
Okay? Yes,
Don't
Dick?
you think that's why some people think?
We were talking about Daniel. Daniel refused to compromise at all. And Peter said we must obey God rather than men. So there's just not any room for compromise there.
Okay, now I'm going to play the devil's advocate here a minute. What did Paul mean when he said he became all things to all people? Was that not compromise?
No.
All things that were lawful.
Lawful. The Jewish law or Roman law?
Christ.
Well, apparently the Jewish law we had.
I think he met people where they were intellectually or culturally without violating the law of God. Whatever level he needed to be at to communicate with someone, same as we do today. We don't sin in doing that. We just use the best of our abilities to communicate with people. And you don't communicate with everyone the same way.
Okay.
If you're communicating with a farmer, you communicate with him different than you would a merchant or someone. You could get on the level they're at and try to comprehend what they're thinking and talking about.
Everyone agree with that? Okay. I think it's important to understand and be able to, or maybe argue is not the best word, but to refute someone who's trying to use that argument. Paul said he became all things. Well, that doesn't mean, yes, Miss Kathy?
I think it's also important that we realize that we have to accept other cultures. We go somewhere, their culture, as long as it's not sinful, that's the exception I'm making.
Okay.
Go somewhere and those people are a little different than we are. We accept that culture. We respect their culture, let me say that. We don't have to perhaps become a part of their culture, but we respect their culture.
Can you give me an example? You brought it up.
I can give an example.
Okay.
I had a friend who married and moved to Saudi Arabia, and there were very few Christians there. But, you know, in their culture, women do not go out by themselves, nor do they go out uncovered, totally covered, except their face.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's not against God's law. So my friend, you know, when she would go out, of course, would have to go with her husband, but then she would also cover herself.
Mm-hmm.
Even though that's not her belief, that was their belief, because she didn't want to offend anyone, you know, that she should come in contact with, that she might have a chance to convert.
Okay. I think that's an excellent example of basically fitting into the culture while still obeying God. You know, and I don't want to offend anyone about what's going on today, but saying, you know, I'm a Christian, I'm not going to cover myself, would have been wrong. That would have been using your liberty in the wrong way. So,
Well, most of us have seen the historical picture. I don't remember which president it was, but the president went to one of the Asian countries, Japan, I think, which it was Jimmy Carter, which at that time in Japan, the woman was required to walk so many feet behind her husband. And Mrs. Carter respected that.
yes.
And she was seen at various places walking behind President Carter. That was just a respect of their culture without having to give in any principles that
Okay.
she might have held otherwise.
what about trying to fit in with a culture that requires you to go and bow down to Buddha or to do something like that? Can't do that, can
You'd
we?
have to be a Daniel in that case.
Okay. Anyone else got a comment?
You only have to fill in.
Just a comment that I think it's hard for us to understand that and to do that. As people from various places in our country and in our society, we have a difficult time doing that. We know what our culture is, and it's a difficult thing sometimes.
Okay. Jane, you were saying something?
We can never let culture determine what we do to God, for God's word. His word stands first. And if the culture differs from that, and whatever they're doing, we're not to be for it or support it.
Okay.
And we can explain to them that we can't violate God's word, even though it's their culture.
Okay. I'm sure we could continue to discuss this a while, but we're going to move on. The last one, how does or maybe not the last one, the vision found in Revelation 6, 9 through 11, which is the altar scene with the saints underneath, help us in understanding the purpose of the book and what is that purpose? And again, Revelation was written to tell them that the persecution wasn't going to be over quickly. It was coming, and it was going to be bad, and it was going to last for a while. And I don't know if anyone has looked at that verse, and we're going to look at it more in a minute, but it said, you keep waiting until more of you have died, which is kind of a harsh way to put it, but that's what he told him. He said, no, more of you got to die first before it comes to an end.
It's also comforting in the fact that he said it won't be that long, you know. Be patient.
He told him to be patient, but he told him it's going to last for a while.
But I mean, it was comforting to them to know that God was with them.
Mm-hmm.
He was taking care of them.
Okay. Anyone have any other comments or questions over this lesson? Yes, Jordan.
Well, like that last comment you said about
Excuse me.
the altar.
Excuse me.
The last comment you said about the altar and how the last comment you had about the altar, I can see where that'd be very difficult for Christians. It's like, okay, you want us to be patient, but more of us are gonna have to die. Like, I can see where that'd be very difficult to find that comfort.
That was not the comforting part. The comforting part was that God is going to win eventually. Not that more of them were going to have to die.
Well, it's just like if you told me that, be patient, Jordan, but someone's gonna kill you, like, I can see where that'd be different.
It would be difficult. I agree. Any other comments? Okay. We'll go on to the third lesson, which again, this is still what I consider to be the introductory part of the book. He's telling us how to study and what to get out of it. And this one discusses the apocalyptic signs, and then we'll get into discussing the various schools of thought regarding Revelation. Has anyone thought about the signs that you read of in this book? You see a goat with 10 horns. Anyone seen a goat with 10 horns? In a picture, but that's about it. What about a lamb with 7 eyes? I'd think, what in the world? So it would be confusing to me. And that's why we're studying these lessons, so we can understand it. how to read this book of symbols. And we've talked about this, but we've got to look at it the way that they did in the first century. We have to look at it with their understanding. We have to basically put ourselves in their culture to understand it. Otherwise, we're not going to understand it. We're not going to get the message. But even early on, even as early as AD 150 or AD 200, they had some confusion about what the book meant. It has a reputation of being difficult to understand, and a lot of people think that it's beyond them.
I don't believe God's word teaches that.
Oh no, it doesn't teach that. It can be understood, otherwise he wouldn't have written it to us. I think today anyone who can drive a car, or who can operate a VCR, or could program one back when we had them, that was difficult for me. But can operate a cell phone. You know, if you can do that with a little effort, you can understand the book of Revelation. Now, you may have to have someone guide you just like the eunuch did. And you have to be careful about who you pick as the guide, but it can be done.
But like we said in the last chapter, there's so many different viewpoints.
Yes, yes.
The last time I studied Revelation in a class like this, it was from a historical view.
Okay.
And, you know,
And that's
been a long time ago, but it made sense when you studied it. But I don't believe that anymore. I don't
Okay.
think that's what it is.
Yeah.
I believe that when this was written, it was written to the people of this time in symbols that they would understand.
Mm-hmm.
I don't make it right just cause I believe it.
No, but we have good evidence to believe that, though. So, however, the author of this study takes the approach that, first of all, we have to identify a couple of things in the book. You have to understand what its major themes are. And it covers a broad array of subjects, but, you know, there's basically three that are the center point. The first one, the relationship between God, the church, and the state. He's telling these people who's on top, who you got to listen to. When John had written the book, Rome had been around for about 850 years. So it was a well-established culture. And this is a picture that someone thought up. But, you know, when you look at that picture, you're not seeing log cabins. You're not seeing mud huts. You're seeing evidence of a civilization that's been there for a while and know what they're doing and have been successful. And so at this time, Rome was pretty much peaking. It was at the top. And this is a little bit to the aside, but whenever you think about the phrase, the fullness of time, I think this is part of it. You had Roman law. The Roman Empire was far spread. It had Rome. It had roads, it had a common language. It had common laws. And so there were a lot of things favorable for the spread of the gospel. Not everything perfect, of course, but it had a lot of things favorable. In the beginning, Christianity was just thought to be one of those funny branches of Judaism. And in Acts 28, verse 22, we have the verse that says, "We desire to hear from you what your views are, with regard to this sect, we know that everywhere it is spoken against." And so they were identifying it as a sect of Judaism because that's where it started. And there were a lot of similarities, believing in only one God, and things like that. So they thought it was part of the Jews first, but later on, they noticed differences, and then they didn't like Christianity so much whenever it was recognized as a separate religion. During the time of Nero, they thought it was a separate but unauthorized religion. It wasn't one of those that the Romans allowed. As Teddy pointed out last week, the Romans often would allow the indigenous populations of these areas to continue practicing their own religion as long as they did what, if it was okay with Rome. But Christianity was something new cropping up, and they didn't like it. It was considered a religio illicita, basically means illicit religion, not authorized. And because it was not authorized, you were an enemy of the Roman Empire or the Roman state if you agreed to that, and basically they could prosecute you however they wanted. Nero's persecution was the beginning, was limited basically to Rome, and these are a couple of pictures that somebody has drawn. Yes, Dick?
Christianity's teaching about a king and a kingdom, misunderstood by them, the nation of the kingdom. It looked more like a rival movement that's starting up that can threaten the Roman Empire. The nature of the kingdom wasn't what they were thinking it was.
That was one of the accusations that they brought before Pilate, was that he says he's a king and he's going to start it up. But you have to give Pilate credit. After he examined it, he said, this isn't a threat to the Roman Empire. It's not what he's talking about. But most people don't investigate it enough to really know. At the time of Domitian, who was the emperor when this book was written, we think, the persecution had kind of spread further. And John, as a result, was a prisoner on the island of Patmos. And in 1:9 he says, I, John, your brother and fellow partaker in the tribulation and kingdom and endurance in Jesus. And so he's saying, I'm also partaking in this tribulation. It's affecting me. He was also a partaker in the kingdom. And it says that he was on the island called Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. He says it's because I'm a Christian that this has happened to me. We can get off on another aside here. Peter said, and I don't remember the verse off the top of my head, but he said, don't complain when you're punished for doing something wrong, but whenever you're punished for being a Christian, you can take pride in that. And that's a very loose paraphrase, but anyone want to elaborate on that a little bit? If we're suffering as a Christian, that's good. If we're suffering because we break the speed limit or because we rob a bank, that doesn't have anything to do with being a Christian. So, okay. John's vision, certainly you start here. If you were in the audience when this book was first being read, you would think, boy, it's fixing to hit the fan. It's going to be bad. Rome was powerful, and no one had been able to stand in their way. And the only thing that was going to be able, up there, no, we're having trouble again here, Ryan. So Rome was big and powerful, and it's going to take somebody like Christ to basically confront them. An individual couldn't do it. Christ is the only one who could do it. Persecutions would continue until the time of Constantine. He gave the church official status through the Edict of Toleration and that of the Edict of Milan. And these are just a couple of slides that I found, but on this left side, the first few lines talk about Roman history, which I don't know enough of to understand. But the Edict of Toleration basically pardoned Christians. He said, okay, you're no longer enemies of the state. But he did ask them, or rather required them, to pray for the emperor. You know. Was that a problem?
They're supposed to do that anyway.
We're supposed to pray for our rulers anyway. Now, in the Edict of Milan, they kind of broadened it and said, well, besides Christianity, it's all these other religions, and we're going to let them go on too. But anyway, this is the first theme that we're having. It's that God was showing through the visions that he's in control of the world. He decides who's ruling and what's happening. He uses them to accomplish his ends in human history. And Dick has made this point several times in the lessons that he's given. He says he punishes individuals in eternity, but he punishes nations in this world, in this time.
Look back at Bible history.
Yes. Bible history certainly teaches us that a lot. This isn't the first time we've heard this message, though. In Daniel 5:21, it says that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms on the earth and sits over them anyone who wishes. And for those of you that were here Wednesday night, Matt gave an excellent talk discussing this. It's talking about King Nebuchadnezzar, says he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beast, and his dwelling was with the wild asses, and they fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men and appointed over it whomsoever he will. Well,
I think that's hard for people to believe today that God puts in power whomsoever he will.
yes, it
People
is.
don't accept, and I know, don't want to get into a political discussion, but I just think that, you know, people forget that whoever is in power, we should pray for them to be the kind of people that they should be. And understand that, you know, the authorities are ordained of God, and that, you know, that we as Christians should hope for the best, not berate and you know, criticize and, you know, things like that. I mean, we have our right to vote, and, you know, we vote, but it's gonna be God's will.
Yes. We should support our government fully as long as it doesn't interfere with God's will.
Yeah, with our, God's will.
That doesn't mean that we can't exercise our rights, though. In this world, or this country, we have the right to complain. You know, a lot of people do it vociferously, but maybe too much, but we still have that right to complain and advocate for change. I think that's one of the things that the founding fathers were wise whenever they set in place.
Well, what does that do with the verse that says do all things without murmuring and complaining, and then being content in whatever state you find yourself?
That's talking about political things, it's not talking about spiritual.
I think we could advocate for change without being a whiner.
Okay?
I think that's possible. There's legal means to advocate for change. We do not have to be a complainer and a troublemaker about it, and a whiner.
question? Okay. So, that was the first theme of the book. The second theme is martyrdom and persecution. In this book, John discusses martyrdom a lot. And it, pretty much constantly throughout. And this is the one that we mentioned a while ago, but it says it's particularly apparent in the vision of the opening of the fifth seal. Here the martyred saints are pictured groveling at the base of the altar of God, crying out for justice. And this is one person's, interpretation of it and painted it. It says, when he opened up the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the witness they had borne. They cried out with a loud voice, O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you will judge and avenge the blood of those who dwell on earth? This is a legitimate question? Okay. You can ask God why he hadn't gotten somebody yet. This is another picture that I found about it. The only answer, and we talked about this a while ago, the only answer they were given is that they should wait a little longer until more of their brethren have died as they did. Now that was a hard answer. John was telling them that it's not going to be quick. You've got to wait a while longer. It's going to continue on.
How many of the apostles were still living at this time? Do you know?
I think traditionally pretty much John.
Just John?
Yes.
I know he was the last one, but I didn't know.
I think I'd have to go back and investigate, but a lot of them died in the 40s, 50s, and 60s.
I studied that, but I can't remember.
However, at the conclusion of this book, these same souls that were under the altar, they're shown seated on the thrones and victoriously reigning with their Lord. And this is a picture that somebody had there. And that bright spot in the middle, that's Christ our God on his throne. You see the creatures down around in front of it, and then you have that huge multitude of saints that were around it, surrounding the throne, praising God. And then we'll get to this later on in the book in more detail, but that's the second theme. And then the third theme was warfare and victory. This is a quote from Homer Haley, who wrote a commentary on the book that I think it's considered one of the better ones, or the best one. But he says, the grandest theme of Revelation is that of war and conflict between good and evil, resulting in victory for the righteous and defeat for the wicked. That's probably the main message of the book of Revelation. These were a couple of slides that, again, I found of it. The one on the right kind of shows that conflict, but Jesus is winning. He's going to win. They did not do it again. There we go. You can see him arm wrestling the devil there, so he's fixing to whoop the devil. The forces of evil are going to make war with the saints of God. And they're going to lose some battles, but ultimately they're going to win the war. And we have to keep that in mind. We have to not get bogged down in each individual battle. We have to keep the long view in mind. So, in the last lesson, we saw the inevitable conquest over evil by the saints. We're told that God's going to give them the mastery. we have to remember that this has already been decided. God has already won this victory. We may not can see it yet. We may not understand it yet, but God has already won, and we have to believe it. Any comments on that?
The end will be victory for the saints.
Excuse me?
The end will be the victory for the saints.
Will be victory for the saints. Yeah. And it's always interesting to me, you know, you think about kids whenever they're choosing up teams and things like that, everybody wants to be on the winning side. Well, we already know who's the winning side, so why aren't more people joining our side?
They don't want to play the game.
Well,
The rules, they don't want the rules.
they don't want the rules to apply to them, do they?
No.
Okay. So that's the end of that section. We're going to start on the next one in the next minute or so, but we're not going to get very far. And this is where we talk about the approaches to the interpretation of Revelation. Whenever I first started trying to decide if I was going to teach this class, this subject, you know, I looked at several different books. And then I tried to compare them. And in this book it was saying one thing and this book was another. And I was scratching my head to say, how can I teach this if I can't even understand what they're saying? I don't get this.
And that's among brethren.
That's among brethren. And when you go even further, it gets wilder. As Ms. Pat was saying a while ago, though, there are 4 to 5 basic groups that have been founded to teach this. And the first one, the futurist approach, and to put it in a name that maybe you're more familiar with, is the premillennialist. And this is the kind of slide that you see about this. It talks about the crucifixion, the church age, the tribulation, the millennium, Satan coming, Satan being loosed, and things like that.
Don't you think some of the confusion today comes in the way that word apocalypse has grown to be used, not the way it was meant
Oh, yes,
at the time that the book was written?
yes.
I mean, apocalypse to people today means, you know, destruction rather than revelation.
I agree with you. Well, I'm glad the bell rang because we didn't get too far into that, and it'll be a good place to start.